I can grab that, and I want to hear what Mr. H has to say about it, because this is something that you've recently covered. Callum Lyle says for $5 Australian, someday I hope you do a video on the Woman King movie, because that's getting a lot of backlash for revisionist propaganda.
Well, and
now,
Mr.
we, of
H,
course,
here,
we haven't covered this movie yet. But Mr. H, you have covered it. I highly recommend people go check out your coverage. The link to your channel is in the description, so everyone can find it there easily. There is no excuse. But for those that have not yet had time to check out your video, take us through. What is the Woman King, and why is it such disgusting propaganda and revisionist history?
So it's not even. I wouldn't even go so far as to call. I think calling it revisionist propaganda is actually too light. Quite frankly, I think it's very sadistic.
Yeah, that's actually insult to propaganda.
Yeah, I mean, it's very sinister. So the movie, we know how the movie has been presented in trailers, and we know how the movie has been presented in interviews. So the movie is about the Dahomey Kingdom, a real life kingdom, with King Gazo, presiding over it, a real life king known as the Slave King. That's what he was. He was the Slave King Gazo. Now, this film obviously centers around the Agoji, which was an all-female part of their military, basically. And essentially, the Agoji carried out. It's not 100% clear from. There's some conflicting sources to state exactly what they actually carried out. So some state that none of it's good, by the way, just as an FYI. So it's not like some sources are saying they're bad, some say that they're really good. All of it is bad. The Agoji used to carry out massacres, beheadings of Dahomey's slaves, because Dahomey as a kingdom rose to prominence and power via the slave trade. They used to ransack every other African, tribe, nation that was around, whatever you want to call it, and they used to capture their enemies and sell them as slaves. Right? They grew to wealth and prominence as an African nation because of slavery. They were actually so influential in the slave trade that they pushed on past the British blockades, and they even ended up ransacking one of the neighboring villages past everything, past the, slavery being abolished. So much so it actually led to the Franco-Dahoman War, because one of the neighboring territories that they ransacked for slaves was part of France's territory. And France just came in and literally curb stomped all of the Agoji. They absolutely obliterated them. So that's what the Dahomans were. They were slavers. And so King Gazo, when he died, the Agoji, which is what this film was actually centered around, slaughtered over 800 slaves in his name. That's how disgusting these individuals were, right? So, to then have, and this is why it's not just revisionist propaganda. So this movie is glorifying these people, because it is. Viola Davis has come out in interviews and said they were superheroes. No, they weren't. They were awful as warriors. They were actually curb stomped by the French. Not that. It's not something you really. There's a meme, obviously, who loses against the French, right? It's a meme. So they were destroyed by the French. They were awful. They were generally nasty. They've painted Viola Davis's character, who's entirely fictional, as being anti-slavery. They weren't. The Agoji perpetrated some of the most nasty, I guess you could call them human rights violations against slaves. Obviously, slaves against human rights anyway, but you see what I mean, right? The most atrocities. That's the word I was looking for.
The worst of the worst in some cases.
Yeah, I mean, truly, they were the worst of the worst. They weren't nice. They used to perform a yearly sacrifice of human slaves, and they're just awful. And this is now being packaged. So it was written in 2017 when the writer went to Benin, which was Dahomey, heard about this, went home, wrote it. It got sent around all the studios in 2017. No one wanted to pick it up, probably for obvious reasons. because Jesus, why I'm not touching this with a barge pole. And then it got picked up in 2020. Obviously, we know exactly why. BLM, it rose to prominence. They're trying to capitalize on that.
Who's the studio that's doing this?
Pardon?
Who's the studio?
Sony, TriStar, it's all of that, basically.
Okay.
It's a combination. And so now it's being sent and packaged to Black Americans as these are the new Black ancestors that you should go and watch this movie. BLM, yeah. Which is wholly sadistic, because these individuals are actually probably the perpetrators of the Black Americans that are being promoted this film, the reason why their ancestors even ended up in slavery and are in the United States. So, I mean, it's utterly disgraceful. It's utterly disgusting. And it's not a case of, because I did this video and loads of people's argument was, yeah, but there's other films that are revisionist history. I don't think there's ever a film which has packaged the British as being anti-slavery at peak Atlantic slave trade, right? I don't think that's ever actually happened. You know, we've not had movies or anything which is the exact opposite of the history and then being packaged to the demographic that were most affected by, the history that is attempted to be being rewritten here. So it's disgusting all round, quite frankly. Not only this, as well, if you actually look into what they wear in the movie, they have sort of made it more simplistic, more warrior woman, Africa, whereas actually they wore more clothes, which is also quite funny as well, because it's just pandering to nonsense stereotypes. So there you go.
Wow.
So this story is slowly coming out. Who's not going to attach it to the movie when it releases?
Well, I mean, it's got 100% fresh rating on Rotten Tomatoes already. So, I mean, that should tell you something, shouldn't it? Surely. I mean,
that should also tell you.
This is textbook.
Tell you something about the reviewers, because I refuse to believe that 100% of reviewers all organically thought that this was the best movie ever. I think there's a little bit of reviewers being, oh, I better not say anything bad about this because they'll call me a Rossacist. So I'm gonna give this movie a really high rating. Yeah, I don't trust that 100% rating as far as I can throw it.
Of course not. I mean, it's just incredibly sadistic, and it also just relies on people's innate stupidity, unfortunately. But not only that, not only does it rely on it, it is expecting people to be stupid, which I guess if you're looking at it from one perspective is pretty racist in and unto itself.
So you have to consider the motivation of all the actors who probably do know the history of it, but are willing to sweep it under the carpet to do this movie. That's quite a leap, don't you think?
Well, I wouldn't give actors that much credit. I mean, John Boyega stood up in Hyde Park during peak
he's
BLM
in this
worldwide. Movie. Yeah, he is. He plays the Slave King.
Okay.
So I'm not going to sit there and at the end of the day, it's obviously heavily motivated by financial gain. I think, unfortunately, we give actors way too much credit. I don't think that they would have done any basic research on this. If they did, and then they also stood by their own convictions that they'd previously stated, which John Boyega does strike me as someone that would, because he has basically tanked his career as a result of some of the things he's done and said. I don't think they'd sign up to it. So I simply don't think... I think we give them a little bit too much credit. I could be wrong, of course, but I just think we give them a little bit too much credit on this. But John Boyega, like I said, I mean, he literally plays the Slave King that has had hundreds, if not thousands, of slaves sacrificed to the real life person that he's playing. And it's not, again, we all accept revisionist history as some of the media that we watch. Braveheart, and there is a lot of revisionist history out there.
Well, Braveheart is fully revisionist history.
but it's never been packaged in a way which is so egregious in terms of based on true events, based on real life, and this movie is. I mean, if you just look at all the adverts, it's based on this, based on that. It's like, I mean, it is.
Based on the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is probably more accurate.
Well, actually, from a Canadian perspective, one of the most egregious movies released was Argo.
That's probably one of the last times I remember a big fuss around a movie that like people are like, "Oh, it's based on a true story," and they're like, "Yeah, it's based on a bunch of bullshit."
It's pretty much revisionist, although it didn't hurt anybody. Like,
that's a big difference there. Yeah, exactly.
Well, this is what I mean. I don't think that there is, of course, a lot of revisionist history out there, but it's quite rare that those movies, like 300, we started with 300. That's a take on a comic book, which is a take on real life events. So it's revisionist history into an adaptation, which is then adapted from that adaptation. But that was not sold as real life fact. It's not sold as based on real events. Okay, and this is, and that's where it becomes again just really egregious. It's sadistic.
I agree. It's to that point where it's even worse than, like, I brought up Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but that to me is one of those points where I remember, they clearly were like using that based on a true story. And it's like, not really.
Fun fact, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is based on the exact same true story as Hitchcock's Psycho.
Exactly. It's based on Ed Gein.
I did not know that.
I mean, there's so much involved with the culture around America's slavery story. I remember seeing, I don't know if you get it in the UK there, H, but there's on PBS, there's a fellow who does people's not geological, but their past.
Genealogical?
Genealogical, thanks.
Who do you think you are? Something like that?
No. Well, it's something like that. It's a fellow named Gates who just meticulously goes through all sorts of famous people in the United States and stars and whatever, authors, and then goes through their past. Anyway, was this one woman who will remain nameless, a black woman, and as he went through her history, he mentions that her relatives actually were slave owners in the United States. And her face just collapsed because it was not part of her personal narrative. And
I mean, people,
you know where I'm coming from here, right? I mean, this is now,
of course,
this is not going to play into the story that many people in the United States want to hear.
No, I mean, at the end of the day, they're also, the other thing which is irritating about this film is you see it in the trailer. They're like, there's a war coming, white man, Europeans. It's like, yes, around that time, we were the ones which abolished it. But you're not going to paint that because it's not something you can package and sell. Again, Slave King Gazo wrote to our monarch, the British Empire, wrote to our monarch, begging to be allowed to continue slavery. Begging to be allowed to continue it. And we were just like, no, of course not. Like, no, we're not going to allow that. And so these uncomfortable truths are obviously going to be omitted from this film. They clearly are. That is, they are. Like, you look at the reviews coming out. They're not going to say that the Agoji were the ones massacring slaves. They're not going to be saying the ones that, then they're simply not going to be, depicting the Dahomey selling slaves. I'm aware that they've depicted the Dahomey as owning slaves, but they're trying to depict it from a perspective of, well, all they did was just take slaves from their enemies. They did, sold them, butchered them, sacrificed them, massacred them. So it's like, well, you sure you've got one bit, but then there's the rest of it, and it's just, well, I think this is, to me, this is quintessential Hollywood, isn't it? This is the perfect, when we say Hollywood is latching onto a bandwagon, Hollywood is milking the cash cow. This is, to me, the quintessential example of that, because they've gone, this is a piece of garbage script floated around for 3 years. No one wanted it. Suddenly, it's convenient. Definitely, we'll have that. There you go. Boom.
Well, The best part about it for me is it's not a comic book. It's not a Star Wars. It's not any of these things to where they can't blame us for not going to see this piece of shit.
Right.
They'll call you racist.
They can call me racist all I want, and I'll just tell them I know what actually fucking happened in this movie is bullshit.
Or they'll call you a misogynist.
They can call me a misogynist. I know, Mister. Like I've heard this every day of my life, man. But like,
the one point that would be of interest to me, because I've been spending an awful lot of time talking about rage tubers and people who respond to it in a reflexive way without it's part of the entertainment now, where people just repeat the same things, and sometimes they say crappy things and they just amplify that. It'll be interesting to see whether people from the Black community actually adopt the narratives that you're talking about, and it's not just picked up by the usual suspects online. Usual.
Just for fun, I have the official narrative here from Collider. I'm just going to read what Collider has to say. The Woman King is essentially a story of survival and saving what you stand for. It is also a story of empowerment.
Wow.
A little bit of background on the Dahomey people might shed some light on the premise of the movie. The historical drama narrates the story of the Dahomey Amazons, known as the Agoge in the Fon language. The Agoge were an all-female military regiment of the Kingdom of Dahomey that existed between the 18th and early 20th centuries. Dahomey Amazons were an anglicized term coined by the European invaders, who found them similar to Amazon warriors in Greek mythology. But there were a few accounts of the kingdom for blah, 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 blah. Nobody cares. Let's see if there's something interesting here. But the constant warfare with the neighboring states and the slave trade to Europe and the Americas reduced the male population, leading the kings to recruit women as soldiers. Interesting little factoid, the Adoge inspired the portrayal of the all-female honor god, the Dorja Malay in Black Panther. So basically it just goes full on narrative here.
Is there anything else there? Did they not talk about the slavery in there at all?
Well, only in the sense that the Europeans were invaders.
I didn't hear
omitting the fact that
the constant wars. The constant wars was them trying to get slaves to sell.
Yeah,
and again, as usual, conveniently ignoring the slave trade from the
survival and empowerment world, about everything they believe in. Goodness,
which started centuries earlier, and in a sense carries on to this day.
Well, we can get into that. That there's still a huge amount of slavery that we have. But
that's the thing.
It's still in Africa, in China. I mean, it's all over the place.
Tinder.
Well, and that's the thing about this movie. And yeah, Mr. H, you can call me a racist for not watching or whatever you want. But like, there's a thing is, it's not like a superhero movie or something to where I'm predisposed to watch it anyway. No. See, and that's where I think the difference is we can just ignore this movie. There's nothing that says we have to pay any attention to it. And, if people want to believe the bullshit, let them believe the bullshit, I guess.
It's bad for society.
It is bad for society, but at the same time, you know what? We've already been living in this revisionist history society for how long now? Nobody's going to change their tune just because of one fucking movie.
But you still have to call it out, Tom.
Absolutely, 110%.
I mean, because like I said, I mean, historical facts that Mr. H was talking about, the fact that they were essentially 20% of the slave trade at the end of the 1700s, with over 9,000 people traded to the Europeans.
The last illegal slaves that ended up in the sort of like American islands, I believe, were actually sent from Dahomey. They continued the slave trade illegally afterwards.